what I will do in the next 15 to 20 minutes is to not to give a kind of a detailed introduction to the book, but I will just talk about a few things. I will give a background to the book, and then I will talk about what I would like to achieve by this book, and then very briefly describe case studies I use, and finally several propositions that can be formulated. So that is the kind of content of my talk today. So when it comes to the background, now we know that when it comes to the global discussion, engineering does not appear prominently in the, for example, 4-decade-long discourse on nationalism. It doesn't appear prominently. Instead, there are threads. One thread we can find is when it comes to engineering and nationalism is the case study-based literature. There are, a number of papers and, other documents written on engineering and nationalism. But, when it comes to the case studies, there can be two categories. One is the modern engineering works and their relationship with the mobilization of nationalism. You can find a lot of work under that. And also, there are discussions on engineers as a community and their role in redefining nations. And there is another thread that is not incorporate in the first thread. That is the discourse on developmental state. That is also a part of discussion of engineering and nationalism. So what I can say is that these threads and lines of investigation remain unconnected. So they are like separate threads and lines of discussions, and they have not contributed towards the formulation of a general theoretical base to discuss engineering and nationalism. So there are, for me, there are, all these kind of attempts in AILS. So when it comes to the local case, except for a few isolated attempts, examination of Sri Lanka as a socio-technological space is yet to be established. Now, I can give a very short list of attempts that was made and can be positioned under engineering and nationalism. For example, AILS Gunawardena and Nira Wickramasinghe, and their work, their works are on certain technologies that was applied in the past. And the discussions are not about modern engineering projects, but some of the technologies that was used in the past. And there are also a few attempts to address modern engineering projects. For example, Serena Tennakon, Nalini Hennayaka, and Patrick Peebles, and all three of them were looking at the accelerated Mahavali development project from a variety of lenses. But the limitation again is the limited attention to the aspect of engineering. So that is the kind of context within which we can start discussing this book. And I can place this book at the crossroads of engineering and nationalism. And maybe I can identify this as one of the initial attempts to engage with engineering and nationalism somewhat comprehensively. And this book is in particular an investigation of the narrative of Sinhala nationalism. Even though I said nationalism, it's about Sinhala nationalism, and also engineering, Sri Lankan engineering, the narrative of Sri Lankan engineering, which are closely linked. So then let me come to the other thing I want to address, what I would like to achieve by this book. Now, in a context where the Sri Lanka we see today is not a technologically advanced country with no real production economy, but an agricultural economy since independence in 1948, and took a turn to a service sector economy since 1977. And also, technological advancement that was there in ancient times. For example, Anuradhapura Kingdom, 4th century BC to 11th century AD, and Polonnaruwa Kingdom, 11th century AD to 13th century AD, was lost and in ruins, and was restored by colonial rule only a few hundred years ago using modern engineering. So that is the kind of context within which I am trying to achieve what I want to achieve in this book. So on the one hand, Sri Lanka is not a, we all know Sri Lanka is not a technologically advanced country, as we know at the present. And also the whatever the technological advancement that I've seen in the past, during the ancient times, were lost several hundred years ago, and it was only restored by the colonial rule using modern engineering. So it is within that context I am exploring how and why the narrative of Sinhalese as a great engineering and technologically advanced nation has been constructed, modified and revised over time. I explore the people and engineering projects that have been included as well as excluded in this process. I also look at how and to what extent engineering as a narrative and also as a technical site is linked to Sinhala nationalism. So that is the kind of broader thing I want to achieve using this book. But if I go into detail in this book, I also try to address the following question. What are the socio-political factors that influence the inclusion and the exclusion of engineering in the nationalist narrative? Number one. Number two, how have the pre- and post-independence ethno-nationalist tensions influenced and defined engineering? And number three, why and when do nationalist narratives undergo revision? And what role does engineering play in such instances? So that is the kind of, the thing I want to, achieve by doing this book. And so to do that, I am using three major case studies. One is the Aberdeen Lakshapan hydroelectric scheme. That is the first ever hydroelectric project implemented in the early half of the 20th century, from 1900 to 1950. And this was designed, campaigned for, and led the construction by now celebrated engineer DJ Vimala Surendra under very difficult circumstances. As we know, hydropower project takes only 4 to 5 years to be implemented, right? Designed and implemented. But this first ever hydroelectric project took, almost 50 years to be completed from the origin of the idea to commissioning. So in 1901, the idea came to Vimala Surendra's mind, the possibility of tapping hydro potential. And it was, in fact, only in 1950, the project was commissioned. So it was a long time. And it was implemented under very difficult circumstances. And very interestingly, he also comes from this caste called Navandana, which is at the bottom of the caste hierarchy. So that is the first case study I'm using for this discussion. And the second case study I'm using is the Accelerated Mahaweli Development Project. That is the largest ever modern engineering project implemented in Sri Lanka by diverting the water of the Mahaweli River, the longest river, to the central and north central province in particular, and there were plans to send water to north as well. And this project was implemented in the latter part of the 20th century. So that is my second case study. And the third case study, and there's a chapter for that, and the title of that chapter is Ravana the Engineer and His Technological Dynasty. So I think you may find this a bit strange. So this is not really a real engineering site, a real engineering project, but a mythical engineering project, site. So I think I better explain why I use this also as a site for my discussion on engineering. So even though the narrative of Ravana, the mythical king in Ramayana, is in circulation for several hundred centuries, as a Sinhala king, Hela king, removed from Ramayana and positioned in a local context. So that is the main thing we have to keep in mind. And it reached its zenith between the year 2000 and 2020. So even though this is a mythical site and had a history of several hundred years, it reached its zenith during the latter part of the 20th century. So I selected this as a case study for several reasons. One is to treat engineering broadly, not just as a technical material space, but as a narrative, myth, conceptual space, etc. And there's a second reason for me to select this. Now, as we know, Ravana, we hear that it is said that had several skills. So he was, for example, a philosopher, a sage, a doctor. But when it comes to the local narrative that has reached unproportional positions during the recent past, Ravana was portrayed mainly as an engineer. So that is the reason I have selected this Ravana the Engineer as my third case study. So let me come to my last section, the propositions, the kind of general theories I can think of using the discussion I conduct in this book. Proposition number one is, now when it comes to popular narratives, like the narrative of Sri Lankan engineering, so strategies are maintained to keep these popular narratives and narratives stable by using different strategies. So different strategies are used to, maintain these narratives smooth and stable. Now, if I give you an example, now when it comes to this, for example, when it comes to the narrative of Sri Lankan engineering, the narrative maintains silences on aspects that disturbs the narrative, right? So there are various areas, I have discussed them in the book. You keep silence, you maintain silence, and then leaving out certain details. So the first narrative I can introduce is that all popular narratives of nationalism are destined to collapse at some point with the addition of more and more details. So there can be a narrative, but if you go on adding details, more details, at some point the narrative will collapse. So that is the first proposition. The second one, now when it comes to technological sites, they are important source of information for social and political inquiry. Now, as we know, the general understanding is that the world of engineering is a separate world, and the world of political and social involvement is another world. But because of this marginalization of the use of technical sites as sources can result in incomplete documentation of history and current socio-political context. So that is the second argument I am making. Now, if I give you an example, now the popular understanding, the general understanding among scholars is that there was no kind of Nehruvian developmental nationalism that in Sri Lanka, as in the case of India. But now, since we have started following the technical sides and engineers, now, for example, when it comes to engineer DJ Vimala Surendra, we come to know that during the first half of the 20th century, there was a widespread Nehruvian developmental nationalism discourse that was there, but very strangely, it remained unrecorded in the history text that was developed so far. So only after we started investigating Aberdeen Lakshapan hydroelectric scheme and following engineer DJ Vimala Surendra, we came to know that such a broad, widespread discourse was there in the country during the first half of the 20th century. So that is my second proposition, that technological sites and technicians and engineers are important sources of information for social and political inquiry. And my proposition number 3 is, now when it comes to engineering and nationalism, almost most of the when it comes to most of the studies that were conducted, the focus was on the narrative generating role of engineering projects, engineering sites. So most of the case studies available are on narrative generating role. But when it comes to, for example, the accelerated Mahaveli development project we were investigating, there's another role played by engineering in the discourse of nationalism. That is action. That means, irrespective of whether there is a narration or not, narrative or not, engineering sites can also engage with action directly. Now, for example, with the enemies of the nation. Now, one thing we came across when we were investigating accelerated Mahaveli development project is to see the case where engineering, the Mahaveli development project itself, engineering scheme, was used to break the continuity of traditional homelands of Tamils. So, as you know, I mean, now it's the from the west to the north to east, it was a continuous land, identify the Tamil nationalists as the traditional homeland. And there were attempts to breach this continuity at 3 points using the Mahaveli Accelerated Development Project. So that is the third proposition. That means engineering has a dual role, not only the narrative generating role, but action. And the fourth proposition, the last proposition I'm making, is that it is about the position of the story of nation's origin when the nation is at the peak of confidence. Now, the accepted wisdom, the general wisdom so far is that nations depends heavily on the stability of the story of origin of the nation and gets defensive when the story is challenged. Now, if the story of the origin is unstable, there is the understanding that the nation itself gets unstable. But what we have found, when we were conducting this study on Ravana, the engineer, is that when a nation is at the peak of its confidence, it provides a rare moment in history where the nation is relaxed and can afford to experiment and replace an existing past by a new past. So that is the kind of fourth provision I can make. So I think I'll stop there, and maybe we can discuss things in detail at the discussion time. Thank you.
Bhusati, do I take over now?
Yes, you can, Harshana.
Okay, all right. Thank you very much. And first of all, my thanks to the American Institute for Sri Lankan Studies for inviting me to moderate this session and to provide some comments on Dileepa's book. So I will try to limit my reflections to a very short period of time so that we have enough time for Q&A. So I would, I mean, one of the things that strikes me about this book and the entire project is that most, what I would say, good research has some form of social and political investment in the context from which that research emerges. So history, as we know, is never just about the past. It is also about the present. We narrate history from the present. And I think one thread that runs throughout Dileepa's book is, it's implicit and sometimes it's explicit as well, is a need to engage with the question of nationalism, particularly Sinhala majoritarian nationalism in Sri Lanka. So in a way, there is a political intervention embedded in this book as well. And to illustrate this, let me just take an anecdote from sort of my own life in Sri Lanka. I have many friends who are scientists, so I'm broadening this out of engineering. And I was educated at a Sinhala Buddhist middle class school. And for many of these people, there is a kind of a very clear division between the world of science and their cultural world. So they never see a connection between the two. But the way they articulate science, the way they articulate technology is deeply ethnocentric and deeply nationalist, but they never see this. And so therefore, sites like engineering, sites like science become places where nationalism can articulate itself in a way where it appears rational, neutral, and culturally neutral. So for instance, the claim that the Sinhalese had a highly advanced technological past is rarely seen as a nationalist claim. It is seen more as something, you know, that can be empirically established and something that is scientifically valid. So there is this kind of schizophrenic kind of division between the two domains, and I think what Dileepa's book does in a very convincing and very powerful way is kind of bring these two things together and show that this supposedly neutral discourse of engineering was deeply invested in nationalism in multiple ways. So I think there are three sort of innovations in this book. One is conceptually, and Dileepa kind of pointed this out as well. It interrupts the kind of the established narrative about Sinhala nationalism in Sri Lanka, that it is always past oriented, and this is in scholarship that is both pro-nationalist as well as anti-nationalist, if you like. Both in many ways see Sri Lankan nationalism as something that is deeply past oriented, but I think particularly in the case study number 1 that Dileepa talked about, Vimala Surendra's project of building the Aberdeen Lakshapana hydroelectric project, I think Dileepa kind of interrupts this narrative and shows, no, there was in fact a kind of a developmental vision, but that kind of gets sidelined due to various political and sociological factors. Second, methodologically, and this is something that has interested me in my own scholarship as well, is how we resist what we call methodological nationalism in social sciences and humanities scholarship. That is, the nation is this kind of ready-made formula, ready-made model into which we kind of fit most of our analysis. And particularly when you're studying nationalism, it's a trap that is very difficult to avoid, because you're trying to narrate the nation, but at the same time to kind of deconstruct it. And I think this book does kind of achieve that, because it shows that nationalism was never one thing, that there were many dissonant voices operating. So for instance, Munidasa Kumaratunga, who is often associated with this kind of past-oriented, romanticized kind of nationalism, Dileepa shows was actually an ardent supporter of this developmental model of forward-looking model of nationalism. And that is often something that gets missed in a lot of scholarship. Then politically, and this point I made already, I believe, Dileepa's book, particularly with the Ravana chapter, makes an intervention into the political present of Sri Lanka, and sort of the kind of the resurgence of the Ravana myth after the conclusion of the war in 2009. Dileepa reads in terms of a kind of a reconfiguration of the singular nationalist imagination. I mean, I don't entirely agree with that proposition, because I think some of the past oriented nature, all of that remains, but I think he's also making a very compelling observation there. Yeah, so with that, I think I will conclude my remarks, because I want to leave as much time as possible for people to ask questions. And I will not ask Dileepa any questions at this point, but allow the audience to begin the process. Thank you.
So Harshana, do you want to take the questions and narrate, or would you prefer that I?
Yeah, I mean, it's people can either if they want to switch on their mics, they can directly ask Dileepa, or feel free to type it on the chat box, and I can then put it across to Dileepa, whatever you prefer.
Okay, there's nothing in the chat right now, so
at the moment there is nothing.
If someone wants to raise their hand or put something in the chat, we'll call on them. I mean, I can ask Dileepa one quick question.
Yeah.
Could you give? You mentioned that narratives lapse when there's too much detail added to them. Could you give an example of that you were thinking of?
This the narrative of engineering in Sri Lanka itself is such a case in the sense that when it comes to the popular narrative, I mean, there are basic features. I mean, we are now if I quote this President Mahinda Rajapaksa. Now, when the Institute of Engineers in Sri Lanka celebrated 100 years of existence in 2006, he gave a message to the publication, and where he says that engineering is in our blood, right? In the sense that Sinhala blood. So, it's an important part of the narrative. But when you start discussing the whole case, so then this idea of Sinhalese being even during ancient times, they being the community that were experts in engineering is questionable, right? There were other developments. There are silences on various aspects. For example, the technology transfer from India and technological development in the world. Now, when you start investigating, you come across, a lot of details that can disturb a kind of a simpler narrative. All the popular narratives are kind of, maintained smoother and simpler by avoiding, by maintaining silences. But, when you start on adding, at some point it is destined to collapse. That is my my proposition.
Thank you.
I think Dinidu raised his hand. Dinidu, you can go ahead and ask your question.
Thank you. Thank you, Harshana. Thank you, Dileepa, for sharing your insights. And thank you, Harshana, for moderating. I have two questions. One, Dileepa, you mentioned how caste became a factor in Vimala Surendra's career. Could you speak to that? I mean, I have not read the book, so I apologize. I'm pretty sure you elaborate on that in the book, but I would like to know, because caste is something that we don't necessarily, we know it's there, but it's kind of it's in the margins. We think it's in the margins. The second question is, Harshana spoke to this, how history intersects with the present, and how we can see through the modern day through most of these projects. So I grew up in a time when Japanese donations pretty much enhanced most of the engineering projects in the country, but I didn't see that much of a nationalist fervor intersecting with Japanese interventions. But I think with the Chinese grants and Chinese donations, and also Indian donations pouring in, is there some kind of swift, how do these new investments from the regional giants kind of reorient nationalism? Do they overlap in some manner? In what ways do Chinese and Indian investments change the nature of engineering social ecology, so to speak, that I did not see happening when Japanese investments were very much part and parcel of the engineering field? Thank you.
Both questions are from me, right? Not the second one is also from, yeah, okay. Now, when it comes to caste, now Vimala Surendra comes from this caste called Navandani, right? It's at the bottom of the caste hierarchy. Now, you won't find the caste involvement when you go through the Hansards. I mean, from 1931 to 36, where Vimala Surendra was a member of the State Council. Now, actually, he finished his engineering career early as a result of frustration, because the Aberdeen Lakshapana project he proposed was not implemented due to various reasons, various tensions, and even conflict between the colonial engineers and the local engineers, and due to several reasons. So what he thought was, he thought that he better become a politician and canvass for the recommencement of the project, because it was stopped halfway. So he was elected to the State Council in 1931 as a member of the Ratnapura electorate. But what happened in 1936 is that he lost the election with a big margin. And there are records that casteism was used heavily during the 1936 election to defeat him. So it had a kind of a big impact, because he lost the opportunity to canvass for it at the State Council after 1936. And when it comes to the second question, what is the role of investment by Chinese and Indians when it comes to Sri Lankan engineering kind of, I mean, if you say narrative, I think our narrative is positioned somewhere else. I mean, we are heavily invested in ancient times, right? So what happens at the present, doesn't disturb that narrative, in my opinion. So not only the investments by India and China, but even what we have done using modern engineering ourselves in Sri Lanka is also not incorporated in the narrative, right? So I don't know whether my response is adequate. So I think that is my response.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. I think Nipun raised his hand next, and then we have two questions in the chat box. So Nipun, you can go.
Thank you, and thank you, Dileepa, for your comments. So I'm calling in from Philadelphia, and I think a lot of my reading here has focused on the role of engineering and technology development in European colonization. And I think much the same way that you describe Sri Lankan Sinhalese nationalism as this political project that is approached from many different angles by many people. I think I'm thinking about colonization the same way. And so I'm wondering, what are the ways that European colonization in Sri Lanka has perhaps like interacted with these kind of Sinhalese nationalist projects through engineering, whether as an oppositional force, maybe a supporting force or something different?
Nipun, I didn't hear the last part of the question. I couldn't. Harshana, did you hear that?
It wasn't very clear to me also, but I think he was asking about whether you have examples of where contemporary projects where engineering projects where Sinhala nationalism played a significant role, if I understood it correctly.
Oh, I can clarify. I apologize if you wouldn't be. Ways that engineering projects that were a part of the Sinhalese nationalist projects interact with colonization projects by European powers.
How Sinhala nationalist projects involved with colonization projects, yeah?
Yes, exactly.
Right. I think now when it comes to the accelerated Mahaweli development scheme, the largest ever modern engineering project implemented in Sri Lanka. I mean, there are various ways to look at it, right? So even in the book, I think I have around 5 to 6 ways of understanding, what the Mahaweli development project means. So there is a very strong case to say that this Mahaweli development scheme was nothing else but a colonization project when you see it from the perspective of Tamil nationalism. So that is a good example.
Just to interrupt Dileepa a moment, I don't know whether Nipun was referring to colonization in that sense or colonization as in British colonization. It was not very clear to me. Nipun, if you can clarify.
Yeah, I think it was British colonization that he was interested in. So colonialism. So how does the fact of colonialism shape the narratives of engineering?
Yeah, okay. Now the thing is even though we say that there is a narrative of engineering, I mean, there is no kind of authoritative, documented narrative of engineering as such, right? So I constructed this narrative by using several sources, right? That was, I think, in the first chapter. So now, if you complicate the narrative, colonization definitely has a role, right? Now, for example, the British colonials actually restored what were in ruins, and but they restored that using modern engineering. And by the time they were restoring it, there was no knowledge of what kind of engineering was used during the ancient times. It was totally, it was gone. It has disappeared, right? So there is there is an interesting argument to say that so what was restored is not really what was existed, but a version of modern engineering. And so in that case, I mean, so what you're asking is a very complicated question. So maybe that is one answer, right? So then colonial intervention, in fact, according to Mahinda Rajapaksa, that engineering is in our blood, right? So because the restoration gave kind of legitimacy and the confidence for the narrative, right? So, and also now when it comes to the narrative of Sri Lankan engineering, where it is investing heavily on the ancient times, I mean, it makes silences on modern engineering interventions, right? So then that in the other way, in the sense that the narrative is so arrogant, it maintains silences on various other interventions that are of modern engineering. So maybe, I mean, you can argue in different ways.
Okay, we have a question from Justin. Justin, if you're online, maybe you can ask it yourself, or I can read it out.
Oh, sure. Yes, thank you. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah.
Yes, I was just going to say that there are a lot of parallels between Sri Lanka and India with respect to claims of fantastic technology in antiquity. And it had occurred to me that among some Hindutva supporters in India today, the notion that India possessed fantastic technological engineering in deep antiquity has become an almost confessional dimension of what it means to be Hindu. To be Hindu for them, it implies belief in these things. And there's the example of the recent Supreme Court case in which one party was attempting to enshrine the Ram Setu, the isthmus between Sri Lanka and India, as a World Heritage Site, claiming that it was man-made in the context of the Ramayana. So I was wondering if you discuss at all or have thought about parallels between the Sri Lankan Buddhist nationalist case and the Indian Hindu nationalist case with respect to engineering marvels for distant past, any similarities or differences? Thank you.
Justin, I think I have not kind of made a comparison between the Indian case and the Sri Lankan case, but I have, I kind of link and discuss India at several places when it comes to developing my arguments. But no, I have not compared the Indian case and the Sri Lankan case as such.
I think briefly, Dileepa, sorry, very briefly, Dileepa, I think you do mention somewhere about the appointment of a scientific committee by the Civil Aviation Authority to study the physics of Ravana's flight, which is in a way similar to what is going on in India. So it's sort of institutional legitimacy for these kinds of narratives.
Yeah, true. I have referred to that, but I think a comparison of similarities of the case in India and Sri Lanka is a huge different study. I think, yeah, I have not not done that incomprehensively.
I think
Okay,
Alexander Alexander has a question. Do you want to ask it yourself? Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Dileepa, for this really excellent book. Got my copy right here. I enjoyed reading it very much. Particularly your chapter on the Lakshapana project, because my own work is on Sripada or Adams Peak. And of course, the Lakshapana project is what allowed the mountain to be electrified with lights all up and down the trail. I found it so fascinating, this huge delay between the planning of the project in 1920 and when it's finally inaugurated in 1950. And in that same time, there's all sorts of micro engineering projects and other mini development projects happening on Sripada, but that is through private donations from Buddhist societies rather than the state, which seemed to operate much more efficiently than the state did. So my question is then, something I kind of wished I was in the book, was what finally opens the floodgates, so to speak, and allows the Lakshapana project to come to completion? Do you think it's just the creation of an independent Ceylon, so you no longer have interference from foreign energy companies like oil companies that you mentioned in the book, where power has to be negotiated in that way? Or do you think it's because the project passes into the hands of other ministers like John Kotelawala, who is pretty much taking credit for the whole thing in the inscription he left in the Makara Torana on the Hatton Trail? There's no mention of Vimala Surendra there at all, although you show that there's a picture or a statue of Vimala Surendra in Norton Bridge. So is it sort of that new charismatic minister in the independence period who pushes the project through? And in a related question, he very much Buddhicizes the Lakshapana project by making a vow to God Saman in order for it to be successfully completed. So do you think that sort of new religious language that Vimala Surendra was not using was essential for kind of completing the whole thing?
I think the Ceylonese elite were, I mean, at the beginning, they were somewhat interested in this Aberdeen Lakshapana project, right? For example, D.S. Senanayake and them actually supported the cause, especially around 1924-5 time. But if you have a general reading about the elite, Ceylonese elite, they were heavily dependent on the colonial economy, right? So the British had no interest in developing this project, because I mean they were importing coal, I think gas and oil, and this British petroleum industry had a market here, even though it was not a big market, right? So they were not interested at all in developing this hydroelectric scheme. At some point, they were trying to kind of sell this to a British company just to prevent locals producing their own energy for a very cheap rate. So I don't think that the Ceylonese elite, the transition of power to Ceylonese elite did do a great job in the completion of the project, because I think it was around 1942 or 3. The project was stopped at several points, and in 1902-03 the project commenced again, and only in 1950 it was commissioned. So we had independence only in 1948. So I think the reason for this is that at some point the imports of British oil to Ceylon was stopped, and that was the case also in India. Now we had our hydroelectric scheme to produce energy, and India also had another scheme to their own energy, and both had the similar treatment from British. So when their interest was gone, I mean there was no particular interest in keeping the supply of oil to the country, they allowed it to happen. I mean that is my understanding.
That's very interesting. I think that's one of the great contributions of your book, is just to show how powerful these fossil fuel companies were even in the early 20th century, that they could kind of derail these massive development projects for their own financial interests.
Yeah.
So we have about another 10 minutes in the session, so we can take another round of questions, I think.
I can ask another question, Harshana.
Yeah.
Perhaps isn't as directly related to the book as the other questions, but I know, Dileepa, that aside from your work in the book, that you've been following the Ravana movement of recent years. At one point, it seemed to be quite closely connected to the former president of Sri Lanka, to Gota. So I'm just wondering whether anecdotally over the past year or so, have you noticed what is going on with, I think, what I understand is sort of the very splintered now discourses. I mean, it's splintered earlier, but presumably even more now with Ravana. And, at one point, some people were speculating that, this could, in a sense, replace or at least become on par with the old Aryan Mahavamsa ideology of the origins of the Sinhalese. Was that type of speculation perhaps done too early? Will Ravana fade away, or do you think it'll continue in various splintered forms to be sort of a powerful alternative to the traditional Mahavamsa version?
Yeah, I think I discussed the relationship between the Ravana search and the Rajapaksha family, right? And it reached a peak just before the end of the war with the Tigers, and just immediately after the war. But I mean, it's a very interesting relationship. Then this Ravana movement went kind of sort of underground after 2015 election, right, where the Yahapalana government came into power. But then it raised its head again when Gotabaya Rajapaksa was becoming powerful, and during the 2019 elections. So, but now, I mean, Rajapaksas who ran the country for 15 years, I mean, that era is gone, right? And the Aragalaya, the famous uprising, people's uprising happened during 2022, actually changed the entire political landscape. I mean, not just the uprising, the dollar crisis and the uprising as a result of that. So I think the era of Rajapakshas are gone, it's gone. And so there is a big possibility that the Ravana movement can also kind of become, it can again go, I mean, it can be dissolved or can go underground. So I can't see any prospect of Rajapakshas rising again. I think that their time is over.
So I think,
sorry.
just very briefly, I did see some reports, I don't know if they were implemented or not, of sort of proposals to change history textbooks to put Ravana in, either alongside or replacing the traditional narrative. You think those are, that sort of thing is gone, I assume, because of the association with the Rajapaksa family.
Yeah, I think it's gone. But in a way, I don't know, I would like to quote my friend Nandana Veeraratna, who once said that now Vijaya story is a myth, and Ravana story is also a myth. So why not go for the kind of interesting story? I mean, since both are myths. So that kind of, because in a way, I don't know, people, some have a sympathy towards the Ravana story because it has got some even progressive points. I think I have described that in my chapter. Now, for example, now when it comes to the Mahavamsa story, it's dominated by Mahavihara, right? And the kind of progressives in the country, I mean, they are having a soft corner for Abhayagiri, where it was influenced by Mahayana. So now when you go, I mean, when you meet the Ravana movement people and go through their narratives, they are also favoring Abhayagiri, right? So and very interestingly, now now there is this document, I mean, so-called document, Varga Purnika, which is heavily quoted by the Ravana movement, where it describes how women ran the country. I mean, the first Buddhist monk was a woman, right? The first to attain enlightenment was a female. And, females were, very prominent in various areas. So, forget the aspect that it's a myth. In certain ways, it's a progressive myth, right? so there can be, various other ideas about it. I mean, so Nandan was, I think, talking about that, even though he's not fond of myths. So, but I think these kind of people are a minority. So that is my response.
So Romola has had her hand raised for a while now. Romola,
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Harshana, and thank you, Dileepa. Dileepa, first I have to confess that I have not read the book, but now listening to you, I wish I had. I just want to ask, I'm not sure whether it was you or Harshana who mentioned something that I would like for whichever of you to clarify, and then I have a question stemming from that. So one of you said, I think that this kind of critique of the state of engineering or anything at all of the nation or the Sinhalese race can occur when there is a state of confidence amongst the people of that race. And I thought that was interesting, but I was also a little distracted and I didn't quite catch the context, because I think it's fascinating. I think it was K.M. De Silva who said that the Sinhalese people are a minority population with a majority population with a minority outlook or a minority complex. So I was wondering where that confidence, that mention came from. And also in that connection, I was wondering whether in the popular narrative about engineering in Sri Lanka, whether there were instances of non-majoritarian, meaning non-Sinhalese contribution that was sort of glossed over or just left to silence, that you had found in your research and perhaps mentioned in your book, Dileepa?
Yeah, I think now, even when it comes to the narrative of engineering, it's a narrative about the engineering skills of the Sinhalese, right? As we know, there were various other, as I said earlier, if you add details, there was a big flow of technology transfer from India, right? And so we maintain a silence on that. And even, even though we say, we kind of project the Sinhalese community as it is now to the ancient times, but even the category of Sinhalese was not there, during the ancient times. It was as we understand it today, right? So that are maintained. I think you are referring to something else also regarding the confidence. That was one of my propositions, where I say that now a nation depends heavily on the nation's the story of the origin of the nation, right? So let's say if we accept the Vijay narrative, right? So we are, we get defensive when the narrative gets challenged, right? Because then that makes the nation unstable. But we kind of tolerated the Ravana narrative at the zenith of this Ravana surge. It is because, my argument is that, that happened as a result of the war victory against the LTT, right? So at a certain point of time, we were celebrating our power, right, as a powerful nation in the world, right? So we defeated the the strongest guerrilla movement in the world.
I see.
So we are putting ourselves with, even superpowers in the world, right? So the Ravana story actually gave us the dignity we wanted compared to the Vijay story. I mean, Vijay story was too small for us after defeating the LTT, right? So my argument is that when a nation is at the peak of the confidence, you are relaxed, and it gives a kind of moment in history where the nation has an existence on its own without the backing of the narrative of the origin, right? So it's a small time space, and there you are even okay to replace a story with another story. The Ravana story is a total contradiction of the Vijay story, or the origin of the nation. Even still, we were okay to replace. I mean, we went to that extent. I mean, I'm talking about the popular reaction, right? Response from the from the society. So that was my proposition. I mean, it's something else. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Yeah, that's the one I missed. Thanks. That's very interesting.
Okay. I think we have sort of used up the time budget for the session. Yeah. So unless there are any pressing questions or comments to Dileepa, I can hand it over to Pusati for conclusion. Is that the format?
Yeah, it's normally the format, but Pusati's unavailable right now, so I'm going to take over her role. And thank you very much, Dileepa, for a very stimulating talk and very interesting answers that you gave to the various questions that were posed. And thanks, Harshana, for your excellent discussion. We have the emails of everybody who registered, so we can send you the information about how you can order the book. It's, of course, very easy to get in Sri Lanka, but it's not carried by, you can't get it through Amazon or anything at this point outside Sri Lanka. So, but there is a way. Alex, you said that you had ordered it online through Sri Lanka and it came, is that right?
Yeah, it's that site slbooks.com, I think.
That's right. That's right. So within the next few days, we'll send an email to everybody who attended or even registered for this talk, giving that order information. So thanks everybody for coming, and especially to Dileepa and Harshana. And this is the first of a series of 3 book talks that we're having on Wednesdays. So you're welcome to join us next week and the following week as well. And there'll be a bit of overlap with Justin Henry's talk 2 weeks from now, since he also, or his entire book is about Ravana. So there'll be an intersection there. So thank you very much.
Thank you.